Welcome back, everybody. We're now moving on to our last session of the conference, continuing on the theme with talks on climate change. So now I'd like to introduce another of the forum's advisory board members, Mr. Mark Rudnicki, who will run our fourth pillar, looking into the future. I can see Mark there now. Great to have you with us, Mark.
Hello.
Excellent. Mark is Professor of Practice in the Forest Biomaterials at the School of Forest Resources and Environmental Science at Michigan Technological University and has a vast experience of the bioeconomy in America as well as around the world. Mark, we're really looking forward to the last session. Welcome.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Mark. It's a pity we couldn't all be together in Ruka, but we can think about all our carbon savings here being online. So welcome everyone to the final session of the 2022 World Bioeconomy Forum, looking to the future. As we make efforts to adapt to climate change, forests are a key, complex, and controversial ecosystem since many of us live in it, and humans have been utilizing and exploiting it and the other forest inhabitants for centuries. Many of the talks in this session will showcase and or grapple with the many practical and I think therefore inspirational approaches being taken to advance the forest bioeconomy and ultimately our ability to live sustainably. And what better way to kick off the final session than with a keynote address from a marine biologist to remind us that our current civilization is now up against planetary boundaries and the interconnectedness of our biosphere. Professor Hans Pörtner received his PhD and habilitated in animal physiology at Münster and Düsseldorf universities. During his scientific career, Dr. Pörtner has developed and validated groundbreaking theories on the impacts of ocean warming, ocean acidification, and hypoxia on marine organisms and ecosystems. His career includes appointments as a research and then Heisenberg Fellow at the German Research Council. He then worked at Dalhousie and Acadia Universities in Nova Scotia, Canada, and the Lovelace Medical Foundation, Albuquerque, New Mexico, before he became professor and is currently head of integrative ecophysiology at Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, Germany. After his earlier contributions as lead author and coordinating lead author to the fourth and fifth assessment cycles of the IPCC, he was elected co-chair of the IPCC Working Group II for AR6 in October of 2015. He is an elected member of the European Academy of Sciences and was appointed by the German government to its Advisory Council on Global Change in 2020. Dr. Pörtner, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here and to talk to you about what IPCC reports and the concepts that we are discussing, like the concept of climate resilient development, could mean for bioeconomy strategies. This is a pleasure indeed, and thanks a lot for your kind words of introduction. And as you can imagine, it has already been quite an evolutionary change for marine biologists to move into these kind of considerations, although I'm sure the blue economy is also an important part of bioeconomy strategies, and that is something that we can maybe discuss in a different context. It would have been nice to be in Ruka, but that is not possible, and I fully agree with the statement that certainly this came with some carbon savings. Let me refer you back to the IPCC reports that we have done during this cycle, and this is the sixth assessment cycle of the IPCC. We produced 3 special reports, 3 working group reports, and are currently working on the synthesis report. This has been the busiest IPCC cycle ever. And sorry to say, and it is very prominent to all of us, I think climate change has been never been as active as during this year and the previous years. And we see really a trend where everybody can feel the changes happening and possibly also the impacts. So there are 3 special reports looking at different degrees of global warming, and the global warming of 1.5 was a strong emphasis of the Paris Agreement. The report on climate change and land, and then one on ocean and cryosphere. And I'm representing IPCC Working Group 2, where we have just in the end of February, in parallel, I must say, I'm sorry to say, to the breakout of the war in Ukraine, we have released the Working Group 2 report, which talks about impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and in a way provides important information that should guide our ambition in climate change mitigation and adaptation, protecting, and part of this is certainly about protection of our natural environment and what it delivers for the bioeconomy. I'm also referring to a co-sponsored workshop between the biodiversity panel and the climate panel. This is the first official collaboration that we've had, a co-sponsored workshop, a report on biodiversity and climate change. And let me just briefly emphasize what is currently happening, and that may be impacting the sector that you are so much interested in. Human pressure on biodiversity is increasing constantly. At the same time, conservation efforts have not been sufficient to stem the loss of biodiversity. And now human-caused climate change is increasingly threatening nature and its contributions to people, causing losses like in overfished stocks, or due to excessive drought, or due to heat waves causing mass mortalities. And then we have these excessive wildfires, have had them in Australia, have had them in Europe, have had them in North America, and other places, telling us that nature is vulnerable, and nature is vulnerable to climate change especially. So the scientific evidence is very clear. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and to the health of the planet. And our Working Group 2 findings are providing the guidance we need for setting global goals and ambition in mitigation and adaptation, and that is also important for the bioeconomy. Just this picture already tells you what's at stake when we talk about forests, for example. Global warming has caused dangerous and widespread disruption in nature that billions of people, including in the bioeconomy sector, depend on. For example, mass mortalities of trees in this drought-stressed forest in California, in the United States. And still, we have so much hope that nature can help us in the current crisis. The bioeconomy depends on biodiversity, and the risk of extinction in biodiversity, according to the results of our report, increases by about tenfold as warming rises from 1.5 degrees to 3 degrees, which is still an option within the currently expressed nationally determined contributions to mitigating climate change. So biodiversity is at stake. At the same time, climate change combines with unsustainable uses of natural resources, habitat destruction, growing urbanization, and inequity. And thereby, these trends are reducing people's and nature's capacity to adapt. And we will focus on the natural side in the following. How do we actually go about quantifying these trends in relation to the degree of global warming? We have a concept by which we evaluate risks. And we look at the hazard, certainly the climate variable that changes or they are changing in combination. We look at vulnerability of the system at stake, and we look at its exposure to the hazard. And all of this gives us an indication of risk. But there is also a need, and I've said that already, to reduce risk by adaptation and mitigation. Both need to be coming together, because there's one important aspect. Adaptation has its limits. And these limits are set by physical, ecological, technological, economic, political, institutional, psychological, and or socio-cultural processes. And these limits to adaptation concern species, concern ecosystems, and they concern human society. And there's more and more information coming up that adaptation limits have already been exceeded for some systems and that we are approaching the limits for others. We are turning the risk evaluated into a color scale, comparing undetectable risk white to moderate yellow to high red and to very high and very high. That's when adaptation limits are very clearly exceeded, whereas some limits may already be exceeded when we talk about high risks. And each of those risks has a clear narrative underneath where changes considered dangerous are at least allocated to the high risk level. So their risks become comparable across different processes and sectors. And here I'm showing you the risks assessments as they have been done for ecosystems, looking at terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems as well as ocean ecosystems. And you see two red lines here. You see on the left-hand side the temperature scale and the 1.5 degrees global warming and 2 degrees global warming being highlighted. And on the terrestrial side, you see, because the warming trends at these levels of global warming are larger on land, you see that the risk transitions are happening quite soon in terms of when we are actually going to reach the 1.5, and that tend to happen between the 1.5 and 2 degrees of global warming, concerning biodiversity loss, structure change to ecosystems, tree mortality, wildfire increase, and carbon loss. And on the marine side, you see one very vulnerable system that has already surpassed its adaptation limits. And these are the warm water coral reefs that are already receding. They're losing coverage with live corals, and they're losing the services to humankind. Other systems like kelp, seagrass, rocky shores, epipelagic salt marshes are a little bit more tolerant and less vulnerable to global warming. But this tells you very clearly there's something about the degrees of global warming being discussed and what they mean in terms of the vulnerability of the natural systems and their capacity to adapt. And for forests, what is especially important is their capacity to store carbon. This is reflecting their productivity. This is reflecting their capacity to store carbon away and help us with climate mitigation. This is important for their resilience by underwarming, drought, and degradation trends. And you see how here from current climate to global warming this is a sort of business scenario called business as usual, but it is actually until 2040 very clearly similar to any of the scenarios. And the warming trend here is what is to be expected anyway. And you see how these red spots are intensifying, indicating a loss of carbon storage capacity. And we already see that loss. We see the turning of some parts of the Amazon, for example, from a carbon storage system into a carbon release system. And there is a challenge also for the African rainforest. Indicated here on this side is the productivity loss from the blue to the orange curve, where across latitudes, the forest systems, all forest systems essentially will experience a decrease in their carbon binding capacity over time. This is our current challenge. We want to develop solutions, and I hear so much about the solutions in this meeting. But at the same time, we need to mitigate the biomass production losses that climate change and overuse of natural resources are actually causing. So let's consider that many of these bio-based products have significant climate mitigation potential. So can they do the job for us in terms of climate mitigation? No, they can support, but they cannot replace the effort to reduce fossil fuel emissions largely and move into renewable energy production systems by electrifying most of those systems. Nonetheless, the use of wood in buildings can be used, and power based on biomass can be used, and biofuels can contribute to reducing carbon emissions, especially from, for example, the air sector and the shipping sector. And we can use bio-based plastics, chemicals, and packaging that could be increased, reducing plastic pollution. All of these can contribute, but they cannot replace emissions reduction. There are further challenges to master. We need to avoid further deforestation and degradation of intact ecosystems, in particular biodiversity and carbon-rich systems, while meeting the growing demands. And what you are doing is representing growing demands. We need to reduce land use competition, which can affect food prices and impact food security and livelihoods with possible knock-on effects related to civil unrest. We need to reduce excessive land use for animal feed production because there's a competition for land. And 80% of our cultured land is currently used to produce animal feed, not to produce food for humans directly. And that is a loss of food efficiency. And so this needs to be certainly paralleled by shifts from meat to plant-based foods. And we need to develop novel food and feed sources, for example, cultured meat, insects, grass-based protein feed, and cellular agriculture. All of these can contribute. We need a transformation of how we actually currently use the biological systems that this planet has available to us. And this also comes with some change in spatial planning. In order to give nature its right to do what it needs to do in order to be resilient and productive. That nature follows some rules. Ecosystems have functions that follow some rules that require certain assets in the environment, certain environmental parameters. And all of this can be best secured by talking about a mosaic landscape where actually effectively conserved places are neighbored by spaces that are sustainably used. And then certainly there need to be places where there are intensive uses. And this mosaic landscape would be valid for the ocean, it would be valid for the terrestrial ecosystems connected. Conserved places would be connected by corridors to allow species to migrate and to, again, allow nature to do its things. This concerns effectively 30 to 50% of land and oceans that need to be effectively conserved and can only be used sustainably. And then if we manage to keep global warming within limits and not exceed 1.5 degrees of global warming, and that is a challenging question of this decade, clearly, then we have adaptation possibilities. And here I highlighted the terrestrial and ocean ecosystem services. So forest-based adaptation has its capacity as indicated by the size of the bullets. And it has synergies with mitigation. Also agroforestry, one of the measures also to protect agriculture against the impacts of extreme climate change, also has its capacity, and it could also be connected with biodiversity management and ecosystem connectivity. And certainly the other sectors are important in this context as well. Social ecological systems, water security, food security to be considered. Nature-based solutions addressing climate change can provide opportunities for sustainable livelihoods, as well as multiple ecosystem services, as I've already highlighted. And climate smart forestry considers the whole value chain and integrates climate objectives into the forest sector management through multiple measures, providing mitigation and adaptation co-benefits. Just an example indicating that nature offers significant solutions for adaptation and mitigation, for example, through agroforestry, building resilience in forests with high biodiversity. And in this example here, you see a Nigerian rubber farmer diversifying his business with food crops, fruit trees, and bees operating in quite a natural system. Strategic integration of appropriate biomass production systems into agricultural landscapes can provide biomass for bioenergy and other bio-based products. So it's not that we should exclude or need to exclude certain activities, but they need to be placed into a broad context. We need to move away from thinking in silos and saying this is the solution, but we need to see how things are connected. There are co-benefits. And if you think about the agroecological agriculture as what we need to go for in the bottom left, then this causes enhanced landscape diversity and habitat quality, retention of nutrients and sediments, erosion control, climate regulation, flood regulation, allows pollination and biological pest and disease control, and supports biodiversity. All of this is what certainly all of us want, and this is endangered by the monoculture system, intense agriculture system on the top left. But we also need to avoid maladaptation. We can, if we want to go into biofuels, be tempted to use large monocultures that reduce biodiversity and that have a high vulnerability to climate change, as we currently see with the monoculture forests in Europe being prone to wildfires. So in a nutshell, there is significant scope for optimizing use of land resources to produce more biomass while reducing adverse effects. Context-specific prioritization, technology innovation in bio-based production, integrative policies, coordinated institutions, and improved governance mechanisms will enhance synergies and minimize trade-offs and mitigate the pressure on our ecosystems that we are currently seeing. And energy conservation and efficiency measures, especially in a situation where we have sleepwalked in our current situation, and the deployment of technologies and systems that do not rely on carbon-based energy are essential for mitigating biomass demand growth as countries need to pursue ambitious climate goals. This is the last point is without any alternative. Ecosystem stewardship is key. So an effective and equitable conservation and restoration of approximately 30 to 50% of land, freshwater, and ocean ecosystems can help ensure a healthy planet. And as you can see, we call this climate resilient development, where we have choices, and many trends and development trends need to be integrated. But there's one very important point. These need to take us into a future where we have limited global warming. If we don't limit global warming, the number of adaptation options available to us will shrink. And that is indicated in this figure where the green path takes us to a healthy planet, but we still have the choice, and some choices take us in that direction that are currently being made, where we have past dependence, exceed adaptation limits, and undermine sustainable development. We are living in a world where every action, every choice and decision matters, and where it is urgent to take climate action. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This report, our report, offers solutions to the world, and is over to you now to use it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mark, can I get up with one question, please, out of the audience, please? Mark, one question out of the audience, please.
Your online audience or the panel audience?
The panel as well here, the online ones as well. Only I would like to bring up one question. We got a lot of very, very important and interesting, very complex information just now, but what will be the real plan to get it done? I think that is a real question, to find a way that we really come to that point, that we come to really solutions. The goals are clear, the influence is clear, but now maybe you can bring up an idea how to get it done, please. Is there any idea how to promote, how to push this solutions? Only just a short answer, please.
Yeah, very short reply. The most important point is that we do not delay action, and these mechanisms of delay are currently still very strong. We have emphasized already in the 1.5 report that political action is the bottleneck. And as you know how our political system works and how lobbyists from different lobby groups influence political decisions, then we'll see that the economic gains that sort of keep us in the past in terms of approaches that we do no longer want and that we should no longer tolerate are actually a key aspect in the implementation gap that we are currently having. I think that is the first and most important aspect to be seen. And then the political sector, the financial sector, all of these need to make the moves to divest, to remove subsidies. We still have subsidies in place that are actually much larger for fossil fuels than for renewables. And that is unbelievable in light of the impacts, the climate change impacts that people and nature are currently experiencing at all latitudes. So very clearly, the international political community has to make very clear and joint decisions what to go for. We have the mechanisms, but we need brave people to do that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Hans, for your talk and response. Yeah, it's a simple question, but I think a very complex answer, really. The solution is complex because we're dealing with the whole global community. Mm-hmm. So I think we should move on now to the panel. And first, I will. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Flora Ismail Tibazarwa, who is the program director currently for the Southern African Innovation Support Program. She has over 9 years of leadership in national research and innovation institutions. She headed a public university department for 6 years and held the position of Director for Life Sciences at the National Science, Technology, and Innovation think tank, COSTECH, for more than 4 years. Flora is passionate about sustainable transformation using green and blue solutions and shares this with other international players as a member of the International Advisory Council Committee of the Global BioEconomy Council. Flora, I will hand it to you to then in turn introduce your panel and moderate your panel.
Thank you, Mark, and greetings to everyone across the world. Thank you for joining us today. The past few years have been hard for global communities in general. The COVID global pandemic and the emergence of several zoonotic diseases have affected our way of life and the global economy, perhaps for many years to come. As we've just heard from Hans, it's not an easy task that we have ahead of us. COP26 in Glasgow presented new pledges and commitments from government, civil society, business leaders, and others to collectively work towards halting and reversing forest loss and land degradation by 2030. These commitments aim to deliver sustainable climate resilient development and promote inclusive rural transformation. We also received the not so good news that humanity has exceeded our planetary boundaries on climate change, land system change, biosphere integrity and biochemical flows, and green water, environmental pollutants, and other novel entities, including plastics. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, as both Mark and Hans have emphasized. This is really complex. So with me today in this virtual space are 4 experts, including Professor Hans, who will unpack with how forests, through our degradation and exploitation, can provide us with solutions contributing to the circular bioeconomy, which is the drumbeat of our forum. I'll introduce them individually and they will share their insights. To ease us into the discussion, each of them will give 5 minutes of their insight and how it relates to our theme, which is the role of forests in the climate resilience development pathway, and how it relates to their work. We start with Professor.
Now you're muted.
Flora, you are muted now.
Sorry. Professor Antti Asikainen is the Executive Vice President for Research in LUC. He has worked for more than 20 years in forest technology and has a keen interest in biomass availability and policy studies, wood harvesting technology, and impacts of wood utilization on forest. He has contributed to several policy briefs for Finnish and EU decision makers on bioenergy and bioeconomy. Professor Asikainen was a member of the Finnish Climate Change Panel from 2016 to 2018 and has headed or coordinated the Boreal Green Bioeconomy program at LUC. He also coordinated large forest bioenergy programs such as the Bioenergy from Forest, Forest Energy, which is a joint research program, and that was going on until 2015 and one since 2011. His accolades include a nomination at the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry in 2013. Professor Antti, let's hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Flora. Can you see my screen now? Okay. So my key message is that the bioeconomy enables the circulation of carbon between the vegetation, in this case forests, and atmosphere, so that society, we as humans, we get our basic needs satisfied. We can construct houses, as was mentioned before, wood can substitute packaging materials, clothing, and especially now in these conditions in Europe, we can use wood as a fuel. And once we have been utilizing wood sources, the carbon stored there is returning to the atmosphere. Right now we are thinking that we could stockpile a lot of carbon to the forest resource, but as was mentioned by previous speakers and earlier today, changing climate is endangering forest carbon stocks. The alternate carbon cycle, if we are not managing our forests or utilizing them, eventually carbon will return to the atmosphere. And maybe one example that many of us remember is the Yellowstone Park, where one third of the area burned, returning the carbon to the atmosphere. This is also the case in the forests available for wood supply. So my key message here is that we can't stop the carbon cycle, but we can choose at least partially which route it takes. And secondly, I want to mention that biodiversity, that is also an essential part of the carbon balance and carbon binding capacity of forest, can be maintained in forests available for wood supply. So we don't always need to establish parks or protection areas. These very figures show fungi that are red listed or becoming very rare and or previously considered to be species living only in the old growth forests. But here, once they have poplar trunks decaying, they can live in a commercial forest also after regeneration cuts. But that's briefly my two key messages. And now I try to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Antti, for those very clear, but very clear messages that we'll come back in our panel discussion to discuss, and so ask the audience to gather their questions. So also with us is Dr. Yitagesu Tekle Tegegne, who is the team leader and senior researcher of the Global Forest Governance European Forest Institute. Dr. Yitagesu coordinates the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance at the Governance Program. He has been working on advancing the knowledge of forest governance, restoration, drivers of land use changes, and policy analysis in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for the past 12 years. His most recent work focuses on public-private partnerships in the forest sector, climate change mitigation, and forest sector reform. Dr. Yitagesu, please share with us your thoughts on the role of engagement and collaboration between government, scientists, and business leaders to promote circular bioeconomy and address the climate crisis we are currently facing.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Flora, for a nice introduction. And before I respond to your question, Flora, I would like to say a few words about circular bioeconomy. Some of them are already mentioned by the previous speakers and in the morning as well. So yeah, as you know, we have arrived at tipping points, and in many respects, it has become too big for our planet. In fact, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, etc., are not different as such. There are different consequences of our economic model, an economic model that is addicted to fossil resources and consumption at all costs. An economic model that has failed to value human health and well-being of nature. So having arrived at such tipping point, we need to rethink our economy, where life, not consumption, becomes stringent and purpose. So a new economy that is powered by nature and prospers in harmony with nature. So that is what some of us call a circular bioeconomy, an economy that is powered by biodiversity. As Antti said, biodiversity actually maintains or contributes to carbon binding capacity of forest. So remember, biodiversity is a prerequisite for life to adapt and evolve in a changing environment. Therefore, a circular bioeconomy has to invest in biodiversity as a priority investment. It also needs to invest in science, technology, and innovation. These, of course, require finance, enabling regulatory frameworks, among many other things. So this is where I see the role and collaboration between government, scientists, business, local communities to promote circular bioeconomy. And also this is why His Royal Highness Prince Charles in 2020 established the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance, CBA. CBA is action-oriented partnership that connects the dots between investors, companies, governmental and non-governmental organizations, and local communities to advance circular bioeconomy on the ground while restoring biodiversity globally. So having said that, I would like to structure my response to your questions, Flora, around 4 enabling action points towards circular bioeconomy, as identified in a multi-author publication led by Mark Palahi, Director of EFI and the Chair of CBA. So the 4 enabling action points indicated there are regulatory frameworks, innovation, finance, research, and education. This is where I see these main actors playing significant role. So the first one is enabling regulatory framework. As you know, unlocking the potential of the circular bioeconomy to decarbonize the global economy while enhancing natural capital and ensuring greater social equality requires a deeply transformative set of policies. For instance, an enabling policy framework at different scales, business, city, regional, national, global, is needed to ensure coherence across policy areas, incentives, and strategies on nature conservation, climate, land management, waste, energy, etc. So the role of government is crucial. So the scientists, in terms of providing latest scientific and practical knowledge in a digestible manner to policy and business decision makers. The second point is on innovation. So sectoral research and innovation are not enough to accelerate and scale up the circular bioeconomy at the necessary pace. So mission-oriented innovation, new types of innovation needs, and collaboration between public and private actors from different sectors and discipline, bio, nano, digital, robotics, business, are needed to create new business models, products, and value chain. And in this process, it's really crucial to engage communities, including indigenous people, in that process of co-creation of solutions. The third enabling point is related to access to finance. So access to finance and risk-taking are key to bringing the circular bioeconomy from niche to norm. Government has own limitation in terms of finance, and hence the role of private sector is crucial. I think it's important to mention here that we should encourage private sectors and others to invest in the context of climate mitigation in setting than offsetting projects. And that is why all our CBA projects are built together with local communities, placing biodiversity at a central position and always identifying value chains that will ensure sustainable sourcing in the landscape we are restoring. So I think as a scientist and representing a science organization, we have a responsibility in providing science to public, private, to develop the right way their plans and strategies for decarbonization and biodiversity restoration. And the final point is related to the fourth enabling point, research and education. So circular bioeconomy research and development needs to be transdisciplinary, combining technology, engineering with complex system thinking. So this research needs to integrate science with traditional knowledge, business, art, design, humanities, as well as involve relevant stakeholders, including local communities, in the process. So strong collaboration and engagement of scientists, but also policymakers, decision makers, business leaders, communities, private sector is crucial to bring circular bioeconomy from norm to from niche to norm. So these are some of my messages with regard to the role of government, business leaders, and scientific in accelerating the circular bioeconomy. Thank you for your attention. Flora, back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yitagesu, and we'll definitely come back to that very rich conversation because it talks about the actors and these are key. How things roll out in the future, it's really up to us and how we engage with each other. Our third panelist is Torbjörn Arne, who is working towards a joint PhD from the Stockholm Resilience Center and Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany. His PhD is part of the Earth Resilience in the Anthropocene Era project, and here the project aims to improve the understanding of critical transitions, shifting the Earth system out of the stable state. Torbjörn's research aims at process-based quantification of interactions among planetary boundaries, thereby investigating how increasing anthropogenic pressure on one aspect of the Earth system contributes to destabilizing others. Torbjörn holds a Master of Science degree in Physical Geography and Ecosystem Science from Lund University in Sweden and a bachelor's degree in Geography from Leipzig University, Germany. He has worked as a research and teaching assistant at Leipzig and supported the research at Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research and Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology in Kenya. Torbjörn, please share with us your thoughts.
Hello, thank you so much for this warm welcome and the great opportunity to talk at the forum. I'll just quickly share my slides over here. All right. So as Flora's already introduced, like my PhD project is about planetary boundaries. So I'll take the opportunity to talk more about them and how they're also linked to bioeconomic sector and of system stability. And like as a starting point, humanity depends on a dependable planet. And the last 10,000 years, an epoch which is also known as the Holocene, has constituted this remarkable stability that allowed humanity to thrive in. And there were conditions of relative stability and also predictability. But as has been pointed out already very, very clearly by Hans earlier today, is that we are exiting this safe zone of stability, and we are actually entering a new epoch, which is called the Anthropocene. And on the bottom right, you can see the global mean temperatures, and I think we all are painfully aware of the reality. And yeah, so what's happening is we need precautionary principles for a functioning Earth system. And for that matter, a group of leading scientists in 2009 have identified 9 key Earth system processes, which are known as the planetary boundaries. And they provide a dashboard of human-altered Earth system dynamics. And these biophysical processes, they constitute like the foundation of the self-regulating capacity and the underlying resilience of the Earth system. And as we can see on the right-hand side, the current situation is not very favorable. And it's actually very alarming that we have already transgressed most of the planetary boundaries. And what's very interesting about the planetary boundaries is like it's providing also like a foundation for new scientific insights and continuous refinements. And there's something I would like to, like Flora has also already mentioned it today, was green water. And I think it's like green water is the backbone for food security, biomass products as well as ecosystem functioning, moisture recycling, and terrestrial CO2 sequestration, and has been recently identified as one of the planetary boundaries. And green water, that is, I should have said it initially, green water, that is the water that is stored in soils and that's available to plants. And in a recent study that colleagues and I have been doing, we identified that we saw, like over the historical period, an increase in anomalies when it comes to green water, which is destabilizing ecological, atmospherical, and biogeochemical processes. But at the same time, water, and especially green water, is linking so many of these planetary boundaries. And I think that's also one of the key messages I want to pitch across over here, is that the planetary boundaries, even though they come off as being isolated, they're not. And Hans has already mentioned that it's a complex system, and we need to act and we need to identify the planetary boundaries in synergies and together, because these synergies of planetary boundaries, they can go in both ends. Like if we are increasing the pressure on climate change, we will see that like it makes a huge difference between the 1.5 or 2 degree target when it comes, for example, to biodiversity, another planetary boundary. But on the flip side, if we act on planetary boundaries, they can also provide positive synergies in order to relieve pressure on other boundaries. A good example for that is like shifting towards plant-based diets, which is not only relieving pressure on the land use, but also like insanely providing good opportunities for biogeochemical cycling, carbon cycling, and also biodiversity. So they operate together and they form together a dynamic system. And in my own personal research, I used like vegetation models to understand these interactions. But that's of course not enough. And what we do need to do is like planetary boundaries are like, let's say, the big picture of like long-term, large-scale impacts of human impairments of the Earth system, but they need to be translated into everyday action and also into action for stakeholders, decision makers, the economy sector, and so on. And it is in this context that interactions are essential to identify a safe corridor into the future. Because I didn't link it here, but there was a study which has been showing that like if you go on full on BECCS, like the energy and carbon capture and storage, which is like providing like a lot of like opportunity to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere by capturing it. It will also like actually on the flip side increase pressure on other terrestrial planetary boundaries. So it's essential to keep the full picture and a holistic view in account. And attending this amazing forum, I see that the bioeconomic sector is full of opportunities, and there's very cool and fantastic opportunities out there to provide smart solutions to lower the pressure on the planetary boundaries. And on the bottom, you can see some reports that have been done in the past to translate the planetary boundaries towards policymakers and stakeholders. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Arne. Now our fourth esteemed panel needs no introduction because he has given the keynote, Professor Hans. I'm going to ask you, Professor Hans, to share 5 additional minutes of your time with some thoughts that you might have picked up on the 3 reflections from our panel members.
My impression, thank you very much for this question. That's a challenge and an opportunity at the same time. And my impression is that the scientific community, with respect to voicing the challenges and with different emphases here and there, we are speaking with one voice. Those who have understood the issues and what's at stake for the planet as a living system are emphasizing the need to act, and they are emphasizing the limits to life on this planet. They are emphasizing that humankind has left its safe climate window by leaving the temperature corridor of the Holocene, the last 12,000 years, where we have not only built our civilization, but we have colonized each corner of the planet. And now we are changing the living conditions on the planet in a way that we not only made nature is migrating or is shifting, abandoning biodiversity is declining in the low latitudes. We see a biodiversity valley forming. The evidence is clearest in the ocean, but it also means habitat loss for humans. And it means that we are exposed, that our species there is exposed to conditions where being outside is becoming lethal during some parts of the year. So in all of this together, there lies so much of a challenge for survival and for livability and for quality of life, that immediate action and the global mobilization against climate change is needed and the only way out. Some people may find that sobering in this insight, and they would like to keep the alternative open to do business as usual. But this opportunity does not exist. It takes us in the wrong direction. So this package is becoming clearer and clearer. Our language is kind of escalating. We are much stronger in what we say altogether. And then we, on the other side, see the inaction in policy and society. There's a gap, and I call that the education gap. There's an education gap that is concerning school kids. It's concerning the adult population, and it's concerning our policymakers who are still living in a world where economic growth and wealth are the goods to strive for, or and leading to overconsumption, as we've heard. So bridging this gap is important. So whatever we do within our sciences, we need to actually help to bridge the gap, building an education initiative that is reaching everybody, changing the school curricula, changing university curricula, and really also making sure that policymakers keep the long-term issues in mind when they do their short-term thinking and decisions. And the pressures on these short-term decisions is what we are currently seeing in the context of the conflict. And there are some of those decisions that are very questionable with respect to the long-term consequences. So I think the picture is becoming clearer and clearer, and we need to take this and bring this message to the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hans. I think it's really a balance, and it's a tricky balance that we need to have. But I'm going to ask, because I'm sure the audience is really excited and wants to ask quite a bit of questions. So I'm going to hand over to Matthias, who will bring back all the questions that the audience has to the panelists. Matthias, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm here. Questions so far, we heard a lot of facts, we heard a lot of important things, and they are very clear. And I think most of us are understanding it. And I understood what Hans was just saying, we need a new education initiative so far. Are we sure that that will happen? Or do we need other actions which will hurt all of us, that we really come to a point that the people react? Because I believe our feeling is that many people still not understood how important these actions are. And what could we do really to bring that information to those people which are not willing to follow the ideas we just discussed here? That's maybe we have to be faster, we have to react. For us it's clear, but for many people still not. How can we improve this process? Could you bring up some ideas, please, for that? I know it's not a nice question, but
so I think it's an important one. You can have a go, and then we ask Professor Pörtner.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting question. First, in principle, I think that it's quite easy to reach the goals that need to be reached to reverse this development. Basically, we should return back to 70s when Club of Rome warned us about the depletion of resources and declining food production. Of course, then came the food revolution and led to the situation where we are today, huge population growth and massive utilization of natural resources, not only for food production, but everything else. So basically, utilization of natural resources at the level that we had around 70s, with the technology that we have today or is under the construction, could reverse the development. It's easy to say, but much more difficult to do. But then the question actually how to make people behave differently. I think that not necessarily everybody understands the urgency, but if we are providing them better technologies, more resource efficient technologies, and maybe even more sustainable lifestyles that influencers convey to them that this is really way to live, we could make this huge change to happen. And there are examples where the energy system has been converted into much more sustainable one without consumers noticing it, utilizing the energy. So not everything that needs to be supported with all population, as long as like Hans said, we need a understanding from policymakers and investors' money to do this transformation.
Okay, I would like to come up with another question. Are we sure?
Matthias, I think Professor Hans wanted to respond to that.
Okay, please.
Yeah, I think I will try and elaborate on something that may nicely complement what Antti has been saying, and that is giving us a story of hope. When we released our 1.5 report in 2018, we saw a social mobilization which was unprecedented in the history of the IPCC. This was the startup of a movement called Fridays for Future that you will all know. The young generation has really taken the messages up and is continuing to take this into policy discussions where they are still confronted with people who don't want to know fully correct. But the number of people wanting policymakers to act on climate change is increasing. And with respect to mobilization, we need to surpass another tipping point, a positive tipping point, a social tipping point, where we have, I think, I don't know exactly where it's located, maybe around 20% of the population, maybe even less, that needs to want to act and use also their consumer pressure. And it's already, the transitions are already happening here with organic food stores and people not wanting to buy anything in plastic and, electric vehicles and so forth. That is already happening, but things are too slow. Then we need legal regulations in place. So we need parliaments to make decisions that are directing the markets, that are constraining the markets and directing them into a certain direction that will again contribute to reaching the social tipping point and modifying individual behaviors. So these pathways are quite clear, but there are these obstacles where people think about the short term and forget about the long-term consequences, which are slowing us down. And these obstacles need to be overcome. And it's based on, yeah, as I said, I mean, essentially we need to do many things at the same time, but we also need to develop a view, a clear view of the path ahead of us. And I'm sure we can still do it.
Okay, thank you very much. And with your last answer, you answered my last question here already, so I don't bring them up again. So many thanks, Flora. Back to you, please. So,
thank you very much, Matthias. I think we're about to, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to think about the last question that I have for you while you give us any closing remarks that you'd really like to share with the audience. We have COP28 next year, and we've had all the complex requirements of how we can reduce the emissions and how we can include bioeconomy solutions that are not necessarily the silver bullet, but can bring us closer, probably can contribute towards the initiatives that we do have. So I'd like us to think about that. How do we partner? How do we engage? How do we educate and raise the awareness that is necessary to really reach good outcomes? What are we expecting, or what would we like to see come this time next year when we have this conversation probably again? What should be different? What should we have done? So I'll start with Dr. Yitagesu.
I'm not sure if I have an answer for you, Flora, but what I can say, listening to Hans and Antti and then responding to all those questions, was that I think our ability to engage and collaborate is essential across sectors and disciplines to solving the problems we are facing, as Hans indicated, the bottlenecks as well, not only the politicians. Also, we need a bit of injection from the private sector, from the industry, and then others, and also to advance the circular bioeconomy from niche to norm. So I think we have no choice but to think, together, work together, and capitalize on our collaborative intelligence. That's what I can say at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Arne, over to you. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I can also just echo what has been said before, that as Professor Hans had already mentioned, we have this educational gap, and I think the science is already very clear of what has to be done. It's lacking the politics, but it's also acting on climate change and the environmental crisis in general. It's not only about science or policymakers, but what we also can see is that the legal framework provides such great opportunities, the economic sector, engineers, and so on. So I think we can, as a species, collaborate and work on this together. And yeah, I think what would be fantastic until next year would be to see more, for example, a carbon emission trading system rolling out on a global scale. I have personally high hopes on that one.
Thank you very much, Arne. To you, Professor Antti and Hans, when you answer this question, I think it would be good for the audience to hear what kind of incentives should push us in the right direction. What kind of incentives need to be put in place, or what kind of sticks, if any, need to be put in place that would make things happen faster, as Matthias was asking?
Well, having sort of technology background, I believe in technological solutions, since we have created this problem with technology. So it's got to be solvable with better and more sustainable technologies. And to do that, what we need is repetition and we need to multiply success stories. There are examples where single societies, even households, or countries or regions have shifted from unsustainable to more sustainable direction, whether it's climate smartness or resource smartness. But you have to show rapidly replicable success stories. Education does give, it is a necessity, but it's slowly impacting medication for this disease. But success stories and multiplying them thousands and even millions of times once we have proven first that there are true success stories from the climate mitigation perspective. And bioeconomy has a lot of that kind of stories to be told and spread worldwide.
Thank you very much, Hans. Sorry, Antti. Hans, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So how to speed up? Justice and equity, we haven't really put into its place yet. I mean, we need some redistribution of resources to enable the most vulnerable to adapt to climate change, because climate change is imposed to them. And although they are striving for kind of a European mode of life, they haven't reached it, and they are the least responsible for the problems that are currently being caused. So that kind of international fairness is needed also to give them the opportunity to do something with renewables rather than going the old fossil fuel way. Closing anything that is keeping us in the old world is important. And I've talked about market, I've talked about regulations, and the last point, what we are currently also seeing is that legal institutions are getting involved. People go to court because constitutional rights are being violated. And that is the intergenerational issue. It's also a fairness issue within societies. And I think all of these need to be exploited as well to speed up. We should not close any door that is taking us into a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. And I just want to recap some of the very insightful comments.
Flora, I do have one more question, please.
Go ahead, Matthias.
A question to Arne, please. Question. Do you think a sustainable bioeconomy needs to demonstrate it is not exceeding planetary boundaries, in particular looking at the synergies and interaction, as you mentioned, such as green water footprint for biomaterials? Maybe a verification framework is needed. Please, could you answer this question?
Yeah, definitely. It's a very good question. And I think the obstacle is, of course, to make the change trackable, right? Like to find out how much on the scale of one planetary boundary or multiple planetary boundaries does a certain solution help or increase the pressure of humanity on a planetary boundary. And the moment we can guarantee that, and I feel like, for example, with climate CO2 is such an easily trackable molecule that it makes it easy in a way to see the impacts, but it's more tricky on other hand, other resources such as green water or also biodiversity loss. The impacts might be a bit more diffuse and harder to grasp, and therefore also to quantify. And yeah, so that's my answer.
Thank you, Arne. Matthias, are we getting any more questions to the panel? It's quite a very complex but very pertinent conversation that we're having. Matthias? If you've dropped off, Matthias, then I'm going to round up and just share a few nuggets of wisdom that I have gathered today. Not sure where it is, so I wouldn't say this afternoon, which is where I am. But I quite like the concept of multiple successes. The forum is exactly doing that, bringing to the fore what kind of solutions are out there and profiling the successes that can contribute to part of the solution. It has to be joint action, that it should, bioeconomies or economies for that matter, from Dr. Yitagesu, should be biodiversity driven or powered by biodiversity. And I think that's really, really important. Closing the gap between policy, education, and actual intervention, science and research, and innovation should come closer together, and we should commonly speak the same language. But I quite liked what Antti brought forward, that sometimes you don't necessarily have to have everyone on board understanding, and that you can, by providing value, push society in the right direction. And so technology has a big role to play in that regard. Collaboration, I think we keep saying this over and over and over again, but how do we do it? How is it really effective? How is it going to make us change? Because we all realize that climate change is upon us and we have to do something about it. But how do we inclusively collaborate and make sure that no one's getting left behind? I like the concept of maladaptation. We shouldn't do that. And justice and equity. We really want justice and equity for our planet. We want peace. We want, so what's going on currently in some parts of the world, like Ukraine, is not necessarily favoring our intervention for climate change, but really pulling us behind, if anything. And we should try and stop that. I'm not going to repeat everything that you have all said. You have amazing amount of information to share. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for making time to join us on the forum and sharing your valuable expertise. Thank you so very much. I'll hand back to the studio.
Thanks a lot for sharing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Okay, back in the studio. Here we are. And I think, Flora, you are still with us. Am I right?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, all good. Well done. Well done. That was
Wow.
quite complex work, as the world is. So well done. So we heard good insights about this very huge topic. Very huge topic.
Yes.
So starting by the presentation by Hans Pörtner, what's the role of this all? And I like very much what he was saying there, that these the bioeconomy can contribute, but it cannot supersede by itself. So it is insight in it is that it requires a collaboration, as you were also addressing that the very many times. Also, they were saying about the urgency, and that's very sensitive matter in a way that that if you overdo it, that we see some symptoms on it, like here in Finland. And when you talk with the next generation, they are even afraid to make a child to this world. So we shouldn't overdo this. Certainly there is an urgency, so it's a very, very, let's say, sensitive matter. But for you, Flora, did you find new things for you on this topic?
Absolutely. I really learned a lot for me the afternoon, I must say, on this. I from each of the participants, the panelists, it was really interesting to hear that even from the north, the more developed countries. Yeah. So Professor Pörtner explaining that even there, still policy doesn't quite understand the urgency, and regulation is still lagging behind, because the assumption is that this is something that can maybe make it more difficult for adoption, but also the realization that it is not so easy to move from reduction of emissions and change how you do things. And I think that's probably one of the things that one doesn't quite grasp. What does it take companies and those that probably are having higher emission levels, to reduce those? What do they need to do? And that's why I was asking the question about what are the incentives that would push someone to make the extra expense and reduce emissions, because climate change does not choose where the impacts come. And so you can't say because I've got the developed country, I will not suffer from floods, and I will not suffer from drought or these extreme events that we're seeing. And I thought that was very, very, very nuanced for me. What Dr. Yitagesu also put up, that really bioeconomy-driven economies or biodiversity-driven economies, for that matter, should be what we think about, and how do we do that? I mean, I think it speaks to the other sessions where a number of solutions and products were being showcased, and how do those actually fit into our country's development plans? I thought the concept of investment, the discussion around the investment, that we really have to put money behind the actions that we're taking. I thought that was also something that was quite interesting. This whole concept that Professor Hans came back to in the last few minutes that he shared, justice and equity, that people are now standing up for their rights, and the legal system is coming to the fore in claiming that this has to be done. So to me, that is the stick that I was asking. What would be the stick when you actually taken to court for going contrary to what is expected? And I think as someone who's really engaged in the entrepreneurial space, I really liked what Professor Antti was suggesting, that technological solutions can also influence how people react or how people adapt and mitigate climate change. They don't necessarily have to know that it is intentional and be preached to about it, but take up these solutions like the use of influencers, something that I never thought about. I thought that was very insightful. So there's a lot of really good information that I picked up this afternoon.
Indeed. In the end of the day, I think that leaves us in a quite optimistic position that these challenging things can be overcome. So like Antti was then mentioned that these Rome back to 1970s, and then later on energy crisis, and if you elaborate that a bit further, that we were having this ocean depletion, one point of time we had that acid rains, and humankind could resolve these, and we are we're supposed to be even more savvy today and also in the future, the next generation. So I still believe that we can resolve these problems while we are working together, and bear in mind that what are the root causes on this all. And I think that we are every day still hearing to remind us about this this global warming. Like today, there was a news that they were saying that this here in Europe, it was the warmest and hottest summer ever. That was then now let's say recorded. So, but still we can overcome these, and we shouldn't lose then the hope. But thanks Flora for the excellent panel and excellent leadership, and thanks for all the panelists, Hans, Antti, Yitagesu, Arne. Thanks for your contribution. We carry on here for a while together with Ida, and nice evening. Hopefully you can stay with us.
Likewise. Take care.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Thank you. And let's see whether we have Ida still with us after her dinner time. So Ida, can you hear us? Okay, here we are. All right. So the final session for you. So, okay, what are your takeaways on this all?
I've become a little bit more cheerful.
Okay.
That is really, really good panel. I really love it. Yes, several key things that I probably could repeat, and my key takeaways. Hans talked about what we've been discussing throughout the panels yesterday and also earlier today about the balance of bioeconomy. The balance basically means integrating conservation, climate, and societal actions through responsible spatial planning. The spatial planning is the design of the forest, the plantation that our bioeconomy industry relies so much on. And he also said that this is something that is very challenging for us players in bioeconomy industries. That large monoculture plantations should be avoided. It's just because they increase other risks. Other risks such as what he mentioned before, tree mortality, biodiversity loss, wildfire, and carbon loss. That's basically because we have not designed the forest in a more he mentioned mosaic and also more balanced way. And but when we talk about risk, we talk about also finance, right? Because we want more finance. And then Hans also mentioned something very interesting. We need to shift subsidy to fossil fuel to subsidize renewable, including bioeconomy, which that makes sense. That means the funding is already there, but how can we actually work together to shift this funding from funding fossil fuels to funding renewables more? And this relates to what Yita said before. We need to change the economic model. The economic model that we've known for so long need to be changed to support this. And one of the key things that Arna said before is basically very closely related or part of the balance of the bioeconomy that Hans mentioned, which is sometimes you don't pay attention to small details, but it's actually not very small or not very, and they are not very isolated, which is like green water. Green water needs to be maintained in a stable and healthy status in the forest to support our forest, which is basically constitutes the backbone of circular bioeconomy. Those are my key takeaways from today's panel. It is really, really, really good, Yuka.
Thanks, Haida. It has been a long day for you, so okay, we carry on still here for a couple of hours. And for the last session, so I think this was a great opening for the final panel. So please still stay with us, because now what we are going to do, we are going to talk about from the business perspective. Is that okay? Carbon credit, is it a business? What does it mean for the forest? What does it mean for the operators? So we have a top experts to sharing their views, and okay, and that panel will be then run by Mark Rudnicki. So please fill up your coffees and stay with us. We will be soon together with you again.